Hi, everybody, and welcome to Business Casual. I'm Craig Fahle. Thank you very much for being with me today. And let's take a look at what's going on around the state of Michigan. We are far removed from the so-called lost decade that we all remember too well here in the state of Michigan. Unemployment is down at historic lows here in the state of Michigan. Even in places like the city of Detroit that have been traditionally difficult to employ people, things are improving across the board. How much credit does the current governor get for that? Well, we're going to find out. Our conversation today is with Governor Rick Snyder. Thank you for being here. We certainly appreciate your time, sir, and it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Well, it's great to be with you, Craig. I love the business casual thing, too. So
well,
I skip
that's
the tie.
it.
You know, I don't do them anyway. So
well, that was the whole point. I mean, you were sort of the inspiration for this mode. You actually sort of allowed everybody to go in that route, with the exception of course, lawyers who still seem to wear ties all the time, but I don't know why that is.
Well, it's great to be with you. I'm happy to talk about what's been going on in the state and the city. It's been wonderful.
Well, you know, you ran on a platform, of course, one tough nerd. We need somebody who understands business to make Michigan ready for what was going to happen in the next century, frankly, to bring us up to date with where a lot of the rest of the country was at that point in time. And really, when we sort of look back on this 8 years, I wonder if you could sort of give us a recollection as to what you felt when you actually got into the office, really started digging into where Michigan was, and trying to figure out exactly what you needed to tackle first, because there was so many different things that were going wrong.
Yeah, well, one of the first things we had to do was get the climate set so employers could grow and want to grow in Michigan. We'd actually seen a huge exodus out of our state. One illustration is the Michigan business tax. I called it the dumbest tax in the country, because it was. If you went down to Indiana, they would tell you the best business development tool the state of Indiana had was the Michigan business tax. That's crazy, because it was discouraging employment. So that's just one illustration, but we went in and got rid of it. We just eliminated the whole thing, because it was funny when I was campaigning. This shows the difference of kind of traditional political people versus needing a new view, is they all talked about cutting it, reducing it by 20%, reducing it by 50%. So my response was, if you take dumb and divide by 2, it was still dumb.
At the same time, though, you had a situation where you're bringing Michigan into the same sort of place that all these other states were. But you're basically changing the balance of taxation. You're taking it off of the back of the big businesses that traditionally supported the state of Michigan for as long as they did, and put a lot more of it on the actual citizens themselves. That kind of transition is difficult. It was not met with universal acclaim. You had a number of people, especially when it comes to the pension tax, that were really, really upset about some of these changes. Is this something that you just knew people would have to grow accustomed to, or were you expecting that to be that kind of backlash?
I didn't do it based on political implications. I did it on good public policy. Because if you looked at, and it wasn't just shifting, actually what we did in the corporate situation is to say it just wasn't fair. We are taxing business, but it had to be reallocated to be on a fair basis, because the Michigan business tax overtaxed some people and undertaxed other people. Now we have a simple system on the pension tax, which is not a tax. We got rid of an exemption.
Yes.
For people that had certain kinds of pension. But the part people forget is we grandfathered everyone in that was older already. And then secondly, we actually created a new exemption for lower income people that were seniors that were working. So I didn't think it was fair. If you think, simple case is if you happen to have the right kind of pension and you were not even a senior, you weren't paying any tax. If you happened to work and you were the Walmart greeter or someone being a cashier to make ends meet and you were a senior, you were probably paying tax. Does that sound fair? No. So what we said is let's get rid of the unfair part and let's create an even system across our state. So if you're a couple making $40,000, you're not going to pay any Michigan tax if you're a senior.
Now,
that's a good answer.
It remained a campaign issue this year.
Yeah, it's because people have created this perception of what it is. Again, that's the issue. To be open with you, I think I've been a better governor than a politician. So there are some cases that these are good policy things, but they don't make good sound bites.
Well, we're going to have time to get into that part of the conversation a little bit later, because that's always been a challenge, you know, in the current political climate that we have right now and the hyper-partisanship that exists. I definitely think we'll get into that. But I do want to talk about some of the challenges that Michigan is still facing and we're facing when you got here. We still haven't figured out some of our more basic infrastructure needs here in the state. This has been a constant battle that you've been fighting with Democrats, with your own party, in regards to getting people on board with what needs to happen. You talk about the perception of Michigan. How bad of a perception do people get when they travel in our state and they're driving in our state?
Well, you step back and look at Michigan. It's a vastly better state in so many dimensions, including infrastructure. I mean, we lost more jobs than anyone else. We have 560,000. We lead the Great Lakes states in job creation. We have low unemployment now versus the highest in the nation. We have 600,000 people with health care. We're leading the Great Lakes states in net inbound bachelor's degrees. So our young people are staying here and coming here, and they're growing here. In terms of infrastructure, we're putting 40% more money into our roads than we were just 5 years ago. And that number is going to continue to increase because of things we've already done. We're doing integrated asset management, a really kind of boring topic for most people, but we're doing something unique that's leading the entire country about saying when we do infrastructure, let's be smart and do multiple kinds of infrastructure at once. These are all great things going on that are fundamentally different.
Fundamentally different. At the same time, convincing people that this is a necessary use of their tax dollars has never been easy. To make Michigan competitive, to make us attractive to businesses that may want to relocate here. These are things that need to be addressed. Your own party in the legislature has never really been on board with this notion of raising the type of revenue that you have suggested we need to get ahead of this, and even just to maintain it at the level it needs to be maintained at. Why have we been unwilling to come to grips with what we truly need when it comes to investment in infrastructure?
Well, I think you're seeing a lot of change. I think there's still work that needs to be done, but we did get it done. $1.2 billion more for roads. I'm working on
short of what you asked for.
That's a good chunk
Which is
of money,
better number than we had, but it was
well,
short of what you and your department head from transportation said we needed.
Well, again, that's a huge improvement. So
Yeah.
you take these in steps to say that's a big improvement, and that's helping all jurisdictions. Part of the issue is the federal government has actually reduced the amount of money we're getting. So this is a national issue. So this isn't just Michigan specific, and I can tell you, I've traveled roads in other places, and their roads aren't so hot either. So we're showing massive improvement. You're going to continue to see more and more orange barrels, and we need to be smarter about investing the money. It's not just about more money. Again, that's back to integrated asset management. Because if you take $1 from our citizens, they have finite choices they need to make with it, and I've always viewed it as we need to be smart about where we invest those dollars, and we have been.
It's a public reception thing, though. People are always convinced that there's just some simple thing we're not thinking about. Oh, just use a different construction technique, or make sure there's no kickbacks from the contractors. There's all sorts of conspiracy theories about this, when in reality it just takes money to do this right, and it takes obviously good management to get it done correctly. But are people unwilling to actually look at the fact that maybe we do need to spend a little bit more on this?
No, I don't. I think people are open to that. I think our citizens are. Again, I am out talking to Michiganders all corners. Their key thing out of their mouth first isn't about reduce my taxes. It's about having better infrastructure in some fashion, and we've been making those investments. What I would say is you have to be smart about is you can't do it's not like flipping a light switch where all of a sudden everything is done and put in place.
Sure.
So we are making a lot of positive progress. It needs to be part of a 10, 20-year philosophy of consistent investment, smart investment, and growing investment over time.
Are the political fights over the allocation of those dollars something that's in the past? Because that is what delayed a lot of the repairs we needed to do to our infrastructure for many, many years. Was there, this goes back to the Engler administration in the mid-'90s, some of the battles over how and who got to spend the money. Have those been put in the rearview mirror?
Again, they'll be revisited on a regular basis, but we actually got stuff done. It only happens on infrastructure about every 20 years when you're talking about roads. And so we've done a great package that's moving forward, that's making good investment. The allocations there is room for continuous improvement there, but it is being deployed in smart ways and smart practices.
Governor Snyder, I do want to talk about, again, the climate for business here in the state. We talked a little bit about taxation, improvement in infrastructure, obviously, a bit. But one of the big things that got a lot of headlines, obviously, was Michigan's elimination of right to work, becoming a right to work state. Talk a little bit about that change, and has it had the impact that its supporters suggested that it might? Because it was, again, it was a huge fight, and there's a lot of political capital that was spent over that argument.
Yeah. Well, if you look at doing right to work was a good thing in our state. One, I believe workers should have the choice. If a union presents a good opportunity for them where they believe they should join. If a union doesn't, they should have the opportunity to say they don't want to pay. So it was common sense to me in terms of the policy itself. But what I would say is the biggest benefit was not just the policy piece of it, it was really the marketing benefit. Because when we became a right-to-work state, it was a signal to the rest of the world that Michigan's open for business. So what it did was it dramatically increased our pipeline of companies now putting Michigan on their list as a place to say they're interested in coming here, where we weren't even making the first cut.
So you take a look at a situation like that, though, talking about putting out the welcome mat for business. Has the actual practical implications of right to work led to many real changes, or was it just a perception change as much as anything?
The perception is the biggest piece of it, because as a practical matter, people forget that most people working don't belong to a union to begin with.
The vast majority.
Yeah, in the private sector side, the union membership in Michigan is in the low teens. It's largely in the public sector is the biggest percentage that's still left. So over 80-some% of all the jobs are not union to begin with. So it's not even relevant to all those categories. What it did was, again, send the message to say Michigan was viewed as an antiquated state, the old Rust Belt state that, hey, we don't even want to look at Michigan. Right to work was really an indicator now to say, hey, they're becoming more thoughtful in their policies. They're doing things to advance and welcome business to our state and welcome jobs in our state. So that pipeline did fill up, and so again, it was really more marketing in terms of substantive impact, but it did have a very positive impact. I can tell you there are a lot of companies that have come to the state and they still talk about how that got their attention.
I have to ask why Michigan's transition in that regard was a little bit easier than our neighboring state, Wisconsin. Scott Walker has obviously just lost in his re-election bid, but Wisconsin had these huge political fights over things like right to work and public sector unions and all these sorts of other things. We had some protests here, some arguments, nowhere near the scale that we saw in Madison, in Lansing. So why do you think Michigan was able to avoid some of the more controversial aspects of that debate that Wisconsin wasn't able to escape?
Relentless positive action. I mean, I'm not anti-union. My goal was to say we had a problem. And in fact, I told people, and people know that, I wasn't working on right to work as an issue. It really came up because the unions made an issue of it.
But when you say something like that, then you have a whole bunch of people wondering, does that mean he's going to veto this legislation if it comes his way? Does that mean he's going to advocate to his party to back off of this?
Again,
you sort of took a neutral corner sort of stance.
I basically said it was the appropriate time based on good public policy. It wasn't about being pro or anti-union. It was not about being a Republican or a Democrat.
I do want to ask a little bit about that, though, because you have been relatively frugal with your veto pen over the years. There have been some high-profile vetoes, but for the most part, you don't want open warfare with the party that's in control of the legislature or the Democrats, for that matter. But talk a little bit about being judicial in the use of that, because there were a number of controversial items. You still need to get your agenda through, so you need support. You can't have a war. But talk a bit about that intersection, again, of politics and what makes good policy, because you were faced with a lot of really difficult bills that you either had to sign or veto over the course of this 8 years. And I don't envy you to be in that position, but talk about what you've sort of used to decide whether or not you're going to sign or not sign.
Well, first of all, let me clear up a misperception. When you talk about that, people don't recognize that in my term in office, for all the acts I've signed, about 87% have been bipartisan. Mm-hmm. In the last 2 or 3 years, over 90-some% of the bills are bipartisan. So this is not a recurring thing in terms of saying people are at conflict. Most bills have broad support from both parties.
Well, they make sense. It's just simple.
Well, again, this is the part, though, that people forget. So I just talked to new legislators to remind them that. And then in that context, to be open with you, I'm a policy guy. And I'm not here to promote a party platform. I'm a proud Republican. But that reflects a philosophy of governing that I think is appropriate. My view is I look at each bill and then make an assessment of what's good public policy. And I don't sign bills that I don't think are going to harm our state.
Give me an idea of a bill that you vetoed that, you're particularly proud of, frankly.
Well, I just vetoed one a few months ago because I didn't think it was appropriate on timing. It was a sales tax exemption for some aircraft. And I told them, I said, you shouldn't pass this now because we don't know what our financial situation is. It's a reasonable question to ask. It could be a good thing at some point in time, but it's not the right time. And if you send it to me, I'm going to veto it. So I vetoed it.
So what's the typical reaction you get when you have that sort of veto threat in your back pocket? I mean, because obviously the legislature is controlled by Republicans. You call yourself a proud Republican. Is there ever any sort of animosity there, or do they understand where you're coming from? How do you avoid that becoming something that's maybe personal as opposed to just a good business decision?
Well, again, it's not just business. We're talking people's lives here.
Sure.
And these are real people, 10 million of people. That's who I work for. So I try to represent them the best I can. And do I have differences with the legislature? Everyone has differences. Any governor and legislator in history have different perspectives. And that's where I still come back to, my point is not to find out why I'm different from they are and argue about that. It's like, what do we find common ground on that is actually in the best interest of our people, and let's do it.
You know, that seems though like a bit of a philosophical difference of opinion in terms of what the role of the governor is. I mean, there are a lot of politicians that will take it upon themselves to become the de facto leader of the party. You can suggest that, like, all right, so it's my agenda, my way or the highway with Congress or with the legislature.
That's worked really well, as you can see in Washington over the last few years.
Well, I want to ask you about that.
What I would say
was it
is
a conscious decision?
I mean,
did you know that going in that you were going to treat it this way, and you weren't going to be sort of the titular head of the Republican Party as opposed to the governor of Michigan?
Again, I was hired by the citizens to be the governor of Michigan.
So
I represent all 10 million people. A great illustration is the city of Detroit. I campaigned in the city of Detroit. I was one of the few Republicans. I had a campaign office in Detroit. I did multiple events in Detroit, and I didn't expect to get many votes, and I didn't. I was in below 5% of the vote in Detroit. But if you look at my commitment to the citizens of Michigan, I believe they deserve better. So if you look at my 8 years in office, I spent literally weeks and weeks working in Detroit because it was the right thing on balance for our citizens.
Well, full disclosure, you know, when I was working at the Detroit Land Bank Authority, I worked a lot with some of your team members. You know, I got to know Rich Baird pretty well and some other folks in your administration on policies that we were working on. You have had a significant commitment to Detroit, and we will talk a lot about that in the second half of this when Sandy Barua from the Detroit Regional Chamber joins us in the conversation. I do still want to talk about some of that civility, because you mentioned just a second ago that what's going on in Washington isn't necessarily working when it comes to this sort of thing. What needs to happen for more people to sort of follow this example of you know, being about the people you're representing as opposed to the partisan aspect of what you're trying to do?
Yeah, again, it's a phrase I use a lot, but and I didn't have a name for it until I became governor. But it is relentless positive action. But what does that mean? That's a phrase. What it means is you stay focused in on what's the problem, not what the personality is, not your personality, not the personality that may be on the other side of the issue. What is the problem? And what common ground can you find to say, if we do this together, if it's 100% of the answer, that's great. If it's 80, if it's 50, if it's 20, let's do whatever percent is showing positive progress, because that shows we can work together now. And you get that done. And it's human nature. If you and I didn't agree on anything but one thing, and we do that one thing, we've proven that we can build trust between one another. We've proven that we can work together. So the next time we say, can we find something to work on, it's going to be a little bit easier.
At the same time, there are a lot of people from outside that are trying to make sure that that cooperation doesn't happen. They lose a political issue, and let's just for a second talk about this. The aftermath of the Flint situation and trying to get that infrastructure fixed in that community, I think a lot of that was really marred by the political gamesmanship that was going on around that issue. Not to suggest that people didn't have a right to be upset, but talk a little bit about whether or not that impacted your ability to effectively solve and fix that infrastructure issue.
Well, it made it, the differences in the public positions of people make it more complicated. But what I would say, and I'm proud of this, is I've not criticized another public figure in my time in office. And I think that's a big part of success. It's not about the personalities. What is the problem and what's the solution? And I view that as that's a reflection of civility. If you don't have anything nice to, didn't your mother teach you if you didn't have anything nice to say about somebody, what should you do?
Not say anything, of course.
Yeah.
But
do you know many politicians that follow that philosophy?
No, I don't.
Well, the interesting part, I always remind people though, and think about this, in your family, does your family agree on everything? No. But do you know how to disagree in the appropriate way with people in your family?
Most
yes.
of the time.
And the same thing is where you work. So it's interesting that we can prove we can do family together, we can do work together, but somehow when we get in this political world, it's okay to drop all these other social norms that have allowed us to be successful, to say it's okay to bully someone, to call someone a name, to try to tear them down or ruin them. That's just terrible. And so being in the public sector, I viewed it as I'm hopefully not better than anyone else, but I've brought the same standards that I was taught in my family, I was taught where I work, my coworkers. I brought them to the public sector. I'm trying to be representative to say we should have that same attitude towards everyone.
Well, we have to take a break here in just a little bit, but I do want to give you an opportunity before we have Sandy Brua join the conversation to talk a little bit about, I want to give you two opportunities. One thing you're really proud of, one thing that you wish you could have gotten done that you haven't been able to do yet.
Yeah, in terms of not getting done would be no-fault insurance reform. It needs to be reformed. And it's a tough issue. I view it
Why
more
the
as,
reluctance to deal with it?
No, I did try to do
Well,
it.
I know you did. I'm not saying you. I'm saying in general. I mean, because
I
you need
think
the help
it's-
of a lot of people to get
I think
that
it's
done.
getting to the point of, I think something will happen, because I believe the public is now attuned to the issue. They're suffering from it, that it will get the attention, and I hope that's one of the reforms we see in the next 12 months. I would love to, if something happened in lame duck, but I'm very doubtful of that because there's so few days left. So in terms of improvements, that's one thing that needs to happen. In terms of accomplishments, we're seeing the city of Detroit. This is absolutely incredible, and it's so exciting. But when I put the city in bankruptcy, not a lot of people thought it was going to be successful.
Well,
And it wasn't about me. It was about everyone rallying together. But if you look at it today, it's interesting. When I travel around the country and I meet people, I ask them when's the last time they've been to Detroit, because I hear a lot of positives from a lot of non-Michigan people around the world about Detroit now. But I'll say, when was the last time you were there? And if they say more than a year or two ago, I tell them, you haven't been to Detroit. I said, it's changing so fast and so dramatically. If you were here 3 years ago, you don't even know all the great stuff going on. Come on back. Isn't that great?
I've been here my entire life. I'm pretty excited about it, but we're going to talk a lot more about that after a break here. My guest, of course, is Michigan Governor Rick Snyder, in office for just a few more weeks before transitioning. We'll talk a little bit about what's going to happen next when we come back. Sandy Brua of the Detroit Regional Chamber is going to join us as well. We want to dig into Detroit. We want to dig into the grand bargain, how Detroit got set on this path towards recovery, what still needs to be done. That is all coming up on Business Casual. Stay with you. Join the Detroit Regional Chamber for this year's Detroit Policy Conference coming up Thursday, February 28th at the Motor City Casino Hotel. The theme this year, Detroit 2030, a vision for the future, confronting key issues and creating an inclusive economy. The 2019 Detroit Policy Conference will provide a platform to discuss a vision for Detroit's next generation. National thought leaders will share insights on urbanism and inclusive development. Local leaders from business, government, and civic organizations will offer their vision for Detroit 2030 and discuss removing barriers to economic prosperity. From education and entrepreneurship to preparing for Census 2020, the conference will offer a day of robust discussions on Detroit's future. Don't miss it. Registration is open now at detroitchamber.com/DPC. Welcome back to Business Casual. I'm Craig Fahle. Our guest today, of course, is Michigan Governor Rick Snyder, at least for another few weeks. We appreciate you being with us. And joining us also in the conversation is Detroit Regional Chamber President and CEO Sandy Brua. Welcome back to the show, sir. Always a pleasure to have you here as well.
Great to be with you, Craig, and always great to be with our great governor.
Absolutely. And, you know, I wanted to bring you into the conversation because, you know, where Detroit is right now, which is where we left off before the break, is really, really remarkable. And something, let's be honest, I wasn't sure I was going to see in my professional lifetime, that I was going to see Detroit on the trajectory it is, and on a comeback trajectory that I think is perhaps more recession-proof than it has been in the past. And I guess I'll start with this question. I want you guys just to jump in where you think it's appropriate, but how ready are we to weather the next downturn in the economy? Because it used to be if Michigan, you know, or if the auto industry got a cold, Michigan got the flu. Where are we now with that?
Well, it's much better, and there are several factors to that. One is we've diversified more and more our economy. So you're seeing great things. Well, look at Quicken's presence down here, a number of the other big companies that are in downtown Detroit that are from a different industry. So we should be proud of that, and we're continuing to see that trend. We're seeing a lot of Silicon Valley companies actually come to Michigan because of the auto industry, though. It's becoming the mobility industry, and it's a convergence. So we're seeing much more in software development, those things which are exciting for us and create a platform for future growth. The other part is people didn't understand the transition in manufacturing as much as they should have. I believed in doubling down to actually say we want manufacturing to grow in Michigan, including the auto, and the auto industry is strong in our state still. And the reason is the productivity now. The amount of people to make a vehicle has dramatically changed, and that's where we suffered so much. That was a terrible transition that we had to suffer through, where many people lost their positions. Now if you look at who's working in an auto plant, they're highly skilled people. They're robotics technicians, they're industrial automation people. There's a lot fewer of them, but these are not people that are simply going to be laid off or let go. These are really highly qualified, great, hardworking people that will continue through a recessionary period in many cases.
But they are going to retire, though, Sandy. So, you're like,
So
one
yeah,
of the things we got to
so
deal
the
with.
retirement question is a different one. So I'll add to what the governor said, just focused on the automotive industry for a second. The auto industry today is so much more resilient than it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago. They have focused on profitability as opposed to volume sold. They have buttoned down their operations in a way. You know, the example I give all the time is General Motors. If General Motors had just gone through bankruptcy, all that would have done is fix the books. It wouldn't have fixed the product to put on the street, but the way they've structured their business, the way they've approaching their product now is completely different than it was, 10, 15 years ago. So they are, companies are much better prepared for a recession. Regarding the workers, so even when you see, we obviously had a major company announce a pretty sizable restructuring. I will almost guarantee you that all those people that are impacted by that are going to find jobs in today's very hot economy. They're going to find jobs with another OEM. They're going to find jobs with a tier 1 or tier 2 manufacturer because they are all scrambling for talent right now. I mean, the unemployment rate in Southeast Michigan in September was 3.7%. That was the national average. I mean, that was amazing. I mean, the state, think about where we've come from a state. In July of 2009, the region's unemployment rate was 17 point some odd percent, right? We're now at or below the national average. That's stunning, and that's so much to do to this governor's leadership.
Well, all right, you went the bankruptcy route with GM. If you just gone through bankruptcy, all you do is just fix the books. You don't necessarily solve the core problem. Let's talk about the city of Detroit. A very controversial decision to appoint Kevin Orr as an emergency manager here to take the city through bankruptcy. Massive deal, massive undertaking. Getting everybody on board was not easy as well. What about Detroit's bankruptcy fixed the issue and not just the books?
No, it was about fixing the issue, and the issue was better services to citizens. Chapter 9 of municipal bankruptcy is not about the money. People don't understand that it's about better services, because if you look at the emergency services didn't exist in a timely fashion, the street lights were out, the trash wasn't being picked up, go down this long list of basic services that weren't being provided that needed to be provided. And so that's what the bankruptcy was about. And if you look at the transition, it really helped create a platform for success that the private sector was already doing some great things within the city. Between the Illiches, Dan Gilbert, a number of other people, Blue Cross Blue Shield, a lot of foundational things were happening in the private sector, but the public sector services were not there.
Everybody knew that Detroit needed to go through some sort of fiscal restructuring, right? But getting the buy-in from the foundation community, from the private sector, from, frankly, elected officials around the region and the citizenry, to get them on board with this change did require a more fundamental change in how things were going to be done. What did it take? And I guess I'll give you first shot at this one, Sandy. What did it take to actually get those people, those moneyed interests that were actually in a position to maybe do something, to believe that this was something beyond just a surface repair?
So, two quick things. So first of all, when the governor first started thinking about that, I was really gratified that he came to us. And the first thing we said is absolutely, because when some people, other elected officials or even some of the business community said, oh my goodness, bankruptcy is going to be terrible, we're going to take a big PR hit. And I said, listen, we don't have to worry about the average guy or gal walking down the street of Phoenix or Denver in terms of what they think about Detroit. We need to worry about the investment community, and the investment community is looking for fundamental change. So let's not focus on the PR challenge, let's focus on the real challenge. Second thing that he did I thought was really wonderful is that when he decided on Kevin, or before Kevin was publicly announced, he had several of us come meet with him one-on-one, and I tell you, I mean, that was one of the most brilliant decisions that I've ever seen made, because Kevin Orr is one of those handful of people that you meet and just they blow your socks off. Today, you know, all these years later, I have a higher opinion today than I did when I first met him, and that's really rare.
Yeah, 'cause the other part is people seem to think the bankruptcy just sort of happened.
Yeah.
It was a 2 or 3 year process, and it was very thoughtful, in my view, that we took it step by step, and we worked in a gradual fashion to have people understand here are the consequences of action or inaction. We tried to avoid the bankruptcy for a long time because, again, could the city have solved these on their own? It became apparent that was not going to happen. So then you have to go to the next step. That's getting into the emergency manager. People think the emergency manager thing was subjective. It was not a subjective process. It's an objective process. Kevin Orr was a subjective choice within that, but he was a wonderful person, and we just stayed on a constant path of saying, how do we keep moving the ball forward to improve Detroit?
And what the governor was willing to do was that he was willing to take the political hits for that decision that then removed the city leadership from having to take those political hits. And it was basically saying, listen, I'll catch the javelin for a while we fix the problem over here, and I'll just catch the javelins. And you don't see many leaders, willing to do that.
One of the things that you had to do, though, is convince people that, hey, if they weren't interested in helping Detroit, all right, that's fine, but just get out of the way. Because there's always been a bit of Detroit fatigue, especially in the legislature. People from outstate perhaps don't necessarily think that the resources should be directed in that. They think, look, given the city's track record, why should we do this? Overcoming that sort of opposition and getting those people who are definitely opposed to it, all right, if you're not going to help, move aside so we can do the work. It's not an easy thing to do, because there was some vocal opposition to what you were doing, but not nearly as much as I was expecting, to be honest with you.
Well, I think it shows the positive power of people working together. People rallied, because when I made that call, I didn't know who was going to come to help, and people did come to help, and I appreciate it. There were legislators that spent a huge amount of time getting their colleagues down here, because if you think about it, many of the legislative people, some of them had never been in the city of Detroit. And so they brought them on tours. They got on buses. They came down. They came and
some of the leaders
visited.
weren't from the Detroit area. They're from other parts of the state that really kind of led the charge.
So it was great to see this kind of leadership and rallying going on. The foundation community, again, many of them had done many projects in Detroit with frustrating experiences. So they had to get to the point of saying, hey, this is the new opportunity to really now make that difference. And they came to the table. And so this was that collective thing. So it wasn't about saying move out of the way. It's like, come to help. It was a rallying cry for help, and people responded. And they responded in a way that made me really proud. It was amazing.
And it really showed that Detroiters, I mean, the people, the lifeblood of this city, who have been here for decades, were anxious for change. They loved their city. They wanted to see a better city. They knew what was happening in the city was not right, was not working, and that's why so many people in the city said, listen, I know this is going to be tough, but this is the right decision for the long-term interests of the city, and I think they've been rewarded for that patience.
Well, obviously not everything is hunky-dory in the city of Detroit. We still have some things to fix. I mean, obviously the lights are now on, the garbage is being picked up, all those service things are being taken care of. You seem to have a very good relationship, and your administration had a great working relationship with Mayor Duggan here in the city of Detroit, but there are still some things that need to be addressed. You said this as much in your address for the State of the Region report the other day. Education is a big problem, not just in the city of Detroit, but in the state of Michigan in general, that every district needs to take a look at its performance. But in cities like Detroit, Flint, Saginaw, Kalamazoo, Grand Rapids, urban education is going to be an issue, and it is the kind of thing that has been pointed out as something we need to fix by business leaders across the country that are looking to relocate. I want to get your thoughts on where we are when it comes to education, what you think could be done or should be done that maybe hasn't happened yet to improve it?
Well, we've done a lot already, though. I mean, if you think about it, people talk about the city of Detroit, but what we did with the public schools is unprecedented. I mean, they had accumulated over $600 million of debt. Mm-hmm. The state of Michigan came and assumed that debt and gave them a clean start. That's not something, if you go back and think about the last 50 years in the state, if you went to our legislature to say, are you going to come up with $600 million plus to help Detroit public schools, the response wouldn't have been positive.
That's the Detroit fatigue.
We got it done, and it got done, and people moved forward, and so there's a great opportunity there. You mentioned a number of cities, though. A great illustration of something that is showing success is Grand Rapids. Grand Rapids is actually having increased attendance now. So it's one of those things. They've been working at it for a number of years. They had a head start on Detroit in terms of having leadership do it, but it shows it can be done. And I'm encouraged by what we're starting to see within the city and the school district, because we want them to succeed. It's critically important for Detroit's long-term success. It's not about the downtown, midtown, it's the neighborhoods. And one of the core things in the neighborhoods are the schools. I'm proud of what we've done with the Detroit Promise. That's been a partnership with the Chamber. Yeah. We're providing college scholarships.
So
I'll let you follow up on that, because I do want to talk. I mean, that's a huge thing that I'm not sure has gotten the type of play that it needs. The Kalamazoo Promise, of course, has gotten a ton of play, but the Detroit Promise is a huge stepping stone for a lot of kids.
Before we talk about the Promise, I just want to kind of challenge you on one thing, Craig. The education challenge we have in the state of Michigan is not just an urban challenge.
Oh, I suggest it's a more intense problem in cities like Detroit.
It is. The challenges we have in rural areas is just as great
Lake County.
as we have in urban areas like Detroit or Flint or Lansing. But also, as a state, unfortunately, our performance vis-a-vis our state competitors across the country is not looking so hot, and our national performance vis-a-vis our OECD competitors is not looking so hot. We're kind of a losing team in a losing league, and we really need to kind of watch out for that. The Detroit Promise, though, is absolutely, I mean, again, thanks to the governor and his team, for partnering with us on this. If you live in the city of Detroit, regardless what kind of school you go to, charter school, private school, public school, doesn't matter, you are guaranteed a minimum of 2 years of community college, completely tuition free, and we have coaches in those community colleges to help that collegiate experience be successful for them. If you're a high performer, we will send you to 4 years of university in the state of Michigan, tuition free. And it's a great thing, and we need more students to take advantage of it.
That's the interesting thing, though. You talk about the auto industry, how these things are changing. You talk about how many of your jobs are going unfilled here because we don't have the skilled trades or the skilled workforce that we need. Where does that responsibility lie, in your opinion, in terms of making sure that workers are ready for the jobs that are going to be here in Michigan, that are here now? Is that something that the private sector needs to step up on when it comes to training initiatives, or is that something that is going to be on the state to make sure that community colleges and high schools, frankly, are preparing people adequately?
It's all our responsibility. It's not just one party. The part I'm proud of at the state is I think we've been the coordinator, the catalyst to bring people together. And that's what we did with the Marshall Plan for Talent. Because the issue is, for too long, and this is a real issue, is we've had kind of the education silo, and then we've had the employer silo. And it sort of worked where each party sort of did their thing and it sort of matched up. Mm-hmm. That's not the way our world works today. So we need them to come together, to partner together in a collaborative fashion, where we need employers actually involved in the schools more, having tours, having visits, explaining what careers are like, helping be mentors, helping our educators, and have our educators educate our employers about here's what they need to help them be successful. Because the world's transitioning. It's going to be much more about competency-based learning. It's going to be much more about certificates, not just degrees. It's going to be much more flexible learning, anytime, any place, any pace, any way. And it's going to be about lifelong learning. Because we're going to have to get trained and retrained once we're done with the traditional kind of 22-year-old segment. If you look at anyone today, quite often you're going to go through 2 or 3 retrainings, and our society is not built for that today. Mm-hmm. In Michigan, we're actually being the thought leader in helping do that in our country.
Go ahead,
Chip. So, we have 690,000 people in Southeast Michigan, the 11 counties that make up Southeast Michigan, that have some college but no degree. So that means there's almost 700,000 of our fellow citizens out there that probably have some college debt, but have no certificate. They don't have a 2-year associate's degree, they don't have a 4-year degree. So imagine the impact we would have on our economy and those families if we were able to get them back into community college, back into university so they could complete their degree. So when the governor says it's everyone's responsibility, he's absolutely right. The educational institutions need to step forward and say, listen, how do I make it easier to have adults come back to finish their training or to get new training? You know, make sure that the programs are geared to the jobs that are available today that will increase their incomes, that are scheduled in a way that are accessible to people. Employers need to step forward by providing time and potentially resources to have employees take advantage of that. And then the individuals themselves need to say, listen, this is going to be worthwhile for me and my family to go do this, so they can help the economy, but more importantly, they can help their families.
All right, I'm jumping around a little bit here because we've only got you for a few more minutes, and I want to ask you about this because we've spent a lot of time talking about manufacturing jobs, and that's what Michigan's been known for. But you were speaking about the tech industry earlier today. That's where you come from, a venture capital background as well. Talk a little bit about the climate for entrepreneurs here in Detroit compared to where it was, and in Michigan, frankly, compared to where it was when you took office. It seems that the amount of venture capital that's available here is light years beyond where it was before.
Oh yeah, it's improved dramatically. And we have it in our DNA, this entrepreneurship, this innovation core. And if you look, West Michigan, Grand Rapids and all that, they've done great at traditional business models and traditional industries. When you start getting into tech, Ann Arbor's been strong for a number of years. So we have had some strong bases to build on, because I was there in the early days of the Ann Arbor venture world. Mm-hmm. But now it's coming to Detroit very quickly, because this has a tremendous environment, that quality of life environment that entrepreneurs want to be part of, young people want to be part of, and it's really taking off. There are buildings now literally being filled by startups, working side by side. What Ford's doing with Corktown is incredible with the train station, because I admire them because they said, we're only going to take half the train station. We're going to save the rest for other tenants. Their phone was ringing off the hook from startup people saying they want to be in that same building because that's cool. So we need to continue that. What I would say is the one element that we need to do more work on is it's not command and control. We need to work on coordinating all these various efforts better and get them communicating and talking to one another, particularly about how to facilitate talent movement. About getting it so we can find out there could be great people in one building that they should actually be talking to these people in this other building. And we can do more of that. The other one that I'm excited about is we've done outreach to other countries. We created the Michigan-Israel Business Accelerator. Mm-hmm. The state, in partnership with the region, did that, and some great community people. Mm-hmm. We created the Michigan-China Innovation Center to do a similar thing. We should continue to do those kind of activities because you can't be an island in venture capital. It's a global marketplace, and we need to be part of that global marketplace, and Detroit is a platform to do that that will help Ann Arbor and Grand Rapids even.
You know, just real quickly, when you look at where Michigan is now in the venture capital space, when this governor walked into office, I think we were 40-something or other. I think we're now 7th.
Wow.
Last I checked. So we've come a long way.
Well, I got to ask one last question for you, and I think it's important. What advice would you give the incoming governor when it comes to making sure that this sort of economic and an entrepreneurial climate continues here in Southeast Michigan and for the state as a whole, especially given where we are politically? If you're talking about international cooperation and relationships internationally, that's all something that Washington is doing its best right now to sort of confuse a little bit. What advice would you give to Gretchen Whitmer about making sure this continues?
Yeah, first of all, stay focused on the talent question, the Marshall Plan, all those kind of opportunities. Because who does the best at getting people career connected from high-tech manufacturing to IT to raw startups is going to have a competitive economic advantage. And so this whole idea of how to facilitate, collaborate, create this mixing of all the talent is critically important. The other one is, as governor, you're the chief marketing officer for the state of Michigan. And to be out there in some fashion on a global scale, having that dialogue and telling our story. And I did multiple trade missions to Europe, to Asia, to the Middle East, to all these different places, and within our country, to the Bay Area, New York, carrying our message. Because you need to be out there getting a consistent message out. The best economic development stuff does not happen in 4 years, doesn't happen in 8 years, it's 10 to 20 years. And so we need a consistent, solid message of how we want to be supportive as government. Because I tell people ultimately, I talk about all the jobs we create. Government does not create jobs. We create the environment for jobs to be created.
Well, we're going to take a break here real quick. We have to say goodbye to Governor Snyder real quick, but Sandy Brew, of course, is going to stick around, and we'll talk about what we need to do to make sure that this continues going forward with the next administration. Governor Snyder, thank you for your time. We appreciate it. Thank you for your service to the state. I don't care what party you're from. You do 8 years as governor of any state. Yeah, you've probably grayed a little bit over that time, but we appreciate it.
Well, I had a
very
head
much.
start, so yeah.
Well, thank you very much. All right, we're going to take a quick break. This is Business Casual. Stay with us. Have you thought about what Detroit could be like in 2030? We'll join the Detroit Regional Chamber for this year's Detroit Policy Conference, where they take a look into the future. Detroit 2030, a vision for the future, confronting key issues, creating an inclusive economy. The 2019 Detroit Policy Conference will provide a platform to discuss a vision for Detroit's next generation. National thought leaders will share insights on urbanism and inclusive development. Local leaders from business, government, and civic organizations will offer their vision for Detroit 2030 and discuss removing barriers to economic prosperity. From education and entrepreneurship to preparing for Census 2020, the conference will offer a day of robust discussions on Detroit's future. That's the Detroit Policy Conference coming up Thursday, February 28th at the Motor City Casino Hotel in downtown Detroit. Learn more and register now at DetroitChamber.com/DPC. Welcome back to Business Casual. I'm Craig Fahle. Thank you very much for being with me. Of course, thanks to Governor Snyder for being our guest today, and thanks to Sandy Brew for sticking around for a little overtime session here. Sandy,
I'm the bonus session.
Well, that's exactly right. Of course, he is the president and CEO of the Detroit Regional Chamber, our partner for this program. You know, trying to boil down 8 years of a governor's legacy in a 20-minute or 30-minute interview is frankly impossible. And obviously, this is a business show, so we wanted to focus on the entrepreneurial climate that exists here in Michigan and the business climate here in the state. And I wanted to talk to you a little bit about, you know, how do you sum up Snyder's legacy and what he's accomplished for the state of Michigan in these 8 years when it comes to that standpoint? Because he came in as a businessman trying to make Michigan better for business. Did he succeed in that?
Yeah, without a doubt. It's not overstating to say that his tenure as governor was remarkable. And I say this as someone who started their career in a U.S. Senate office and worked for 2 presidents. I put Rick Snyder right up there at the top of people who've actually got things done. I mean, if we would get into our time machines, and I know you have one, if we go back into our time machines and went back to 2008 and said, gosh, in 2018, the unemployment rate in Michigan is going to be at or below the national average, that Michigan will have created 600,000 new private sector jobs, that the auto industry would be hot as a pistol, you'd say, no, you're crazy. And if you further would have said, listen, the city of Detroit is going to be a city that is not only recovering, but is now a city that the rest of the state can be proud of and is one of the hottest cities in the country, you would have said you were nuts. No one would have believed that. But the fact that it's happened over the last 8 years, and so much is due to the governor's very unique brand of leadership, is really something we should be grateful for.
But he hinted at this. He talked about how things in Washington are not working the way he would like. We talked a little bit about what's happening in Wisconsin, our neighboring state, and how he didn't necessarily appreciate the approach that was happening there. How do you think he's been able to avoid some of the partisan pitfalls that frankly have been holding a lot of us back in terms of cooperation and actually coming up with solutions?
I think it's fitting that just this winter we lost President George Herbert Walker Bush, and both the governor and I were in Washington to honor President Bush, who was my boss at one point. And there's a lot of similarities between the two. I mean, just the civility, the focus on just moving things forward. I mean, yes, sometimes you have to be political. Every political person has to, but the amount in which you do it, the tenor in which you do it, and just your approach to governing, and I mean that governing as opposed to politics, is so important, and I think he and the former president were very much cut from the same cloth, and you just don't see that in public service anymore. You really, really don't. Everyone is kind of going for the jugular. Everyone's looking for that kind of soundbite that'll look good on the evening news or in a tweet. And Rick Snyder didn't govern that way, and neither did George Herbert Walker Bush.
Well, obviously, we are getting ready to transition to a new administration here in the state of Michigan. Gretchen Whitmer is going to be taking over. She's got a ton of legislative experience, obviously. I know you've known her for a long time. I asked the governor the question about what she needs to do to make sure that the trajectory stays on the right path here for the state of Michigan and for this region that we obviously care a lot about. I want to know what advice you're going to suggest that she follow in terms of making sure that this economy stays on track, becomes somewhat recession-proof as opposed to what we were dealing with before.
Well, first of all, we have a lot of respect for Gretchen Whitmer. The Detroit Regional Chamber PAC endorsed her.
You did.
And and she does have a great legislative record and experience, so we think that'll bode well for her. But I will steal a phrase from my friend Doug Rothwell, who runs Business Leaders for Michigan. He says, the greatest consistency about Michigan is its inconsistency in public policy approaches. And that is something that we really need to guard against. The governor alluded to it when he was sitting in that chair. When states have a consistent policy, either an economic development policy, taxation policy, over an extended period of time, not just 4 years or 8 years, but 10 years, 20 years, those states have a tendency to be successful. When you look at the most successful economic development states, it's not so much about their policy per se, it's about the consistency of their policy from one administration to the other.
Well, look at Boston and so-called Taxachusetts. Right. I mean, they do not exactly have the most competitive tax rate in the world, but they still seem to be successful. That's about talent.
Not always, exactly right. It's not always about taxation. I always tell people taxation is a value proposition. You can charge Cadillac level taxation rates, but you better be providing Cadillac level services, and that includes Cadillac level access to talent. You can't charge Cadillac level prices and provide Kia level services. That's the disconnect that voters won't stand for.
Well, one last question for you. I mean, obviously campaigns are campaigns. People are going to say what they want to say. What's a great slogan? What are people going to respond to? Fix the damn roads was obviously something that worked very well for Gretchen Whitmer. But there have been a lot of other discussions about, all right, maybe it's time to revisit the pension tax question. Maybe it's time to revisit some of the changes that were made during the Snyder administration. Is there anything that you're concerned about that you've been hearing from the incoming administration that makes you think that you need to work with them a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, even though we endorse Gretchen Whitmer and we look forward to working with her and we're going to help her as much as we can, if she does go and, make the pension tax unfair again, where some people have zero tax, but some people, if you worked at Walmart, at the same salary, you now are taxed. I mean, we're gonna challenge her on that. Right to work is an issue that we actually abstained from, but now that we have it, we agree with the governor. It has been a tremendous marketing tool for the state and for the MEDC. We support that. So there are things that we might disagree with her on. So hopefully again we can keep a consistent approach. I mean, that is so important. There's lots of opportunity for Gretchen Whitmer and the new legislature to focus on, right? Education, still there's a lot of work that needs to be done on education. There's more work that needs to be done on infrastructure. There's no doubt about that. There's more work that needs to be done on next generation mobility to keep Michigan at the bleeding edge.
We can't take that for granted.
At the bleeding edge of next generation mobility, the autonomous vehicle. We have more work to do on that.
Well, we'll leave it right there, but this is just scratching the surface of what this program is going to be about. Business Casual, of course. We're going to be looking at all kinds of different aspects with business and what's going to make this region competitive, what's going to make Metro Detroit thrive for decades to come. That's the goal of this program, is to really explore all of those things. Special thanks to Sandy Brewer for being here today. Appreciate it very much, sir, and look forward to a long partnership.
Thanks so much, and thanks for the partnership.
And this is Business Casual. I'm Craig. We'll see you next time.